We tackle some pretty heavy stuff on the deep dive, but today's topic is especially uh, unnerving. I mean, we're talking about the possibility of a second U.S. Civil War. And it is not just like some random speculation. This is based on an assessment by Grok, the AI funded by Elon Musk.
Right. So for this deep dive, we're going to be focusing on Grok's analysis, specifically a conversation it had with Seth Abramson. You might know him. He's a biographer who's written extensively on both Trump and, interestingly, Musk. What we want to do is break down Grok's reasoning. What factors did it consider? And what does this AI think could be in store for the United States? We want to give you, the listener, a clear picture of this complex issue.
Yep, think of this as your guide to wrapping your head around a potentially huge event. So Grok's initial assessment. On March 17th, 2025, it put the probability of a second civil war before November 2026 at somewhere between 15% and 20%. Now, that may not sound super high, but it's definitely not nothing, right? Grok highlighted some major factors like, obviously, political polarization. We all see that, right? And the ripple effects from the 2020 election and, of course, the January 6th riot. All pretty heavy stuff.
Now, what I find interesting is that even in this initial assessment, Grok didn't just look at what could spark a conflict. It also considered things that might hold it back. Things like the unifying role of the U.S. military, law enforcement, and the fact that most Americans still prefer legal and electoral solutions to disputes.
Right. But the conversation took a pretty dark turn when Abramson brought up a point that Grok's initial calculation may have missed. Like, what if the Trump administration just ignores court orders? And even more worrying, what if they start purging the military, getting rid of officers seen as more loyal to the Constitution than to Trump himself?
Yeah, that raises a really important question about checks and balances. Abramson pointed to reports, and these are from big outlets like Reuters, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, all of them documenting cases in early 2025 where the Trump administration kept pushing policies. For example, stuff against DEI, even though courts had ruled against them. And even more concerning, there were reports of senior military leaders being targeted. We're talking about people like Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General C.Q. Brown, Admiral Lisa Franchetti. The possibility that they were being replaced with folks seen as more loyal to the administration, like Lieutenant General Dan Kane.
Okay, so let's think about what this means in the real world. What happens if an administration starts openly defying the courts? It feels like that just rips apart the whole idea of our legal system,
Exactly. It undermines the entire concept of the rule of law. When the executive branch just ignores what the courts say, it opens the door for states to resist federal authority, especially states that already disagree with the administration. It's kind of like what happened back when there was resistance to school desegregation after Brown v. Board of Education, Now imagine a military where the leaders put loyalty to Trump above their duty to the Constitution. You could have a situation where they're used to enforce the administration's will, even if it's illegal, maybe even against states that are pushing back.
And the military being purged based on loyalty. I mean, the U.S. military has always been nonpartisan. It's like a safety net for our democracy. Politicizing it like that seems incredibly dangerous.
It's extremely destabilizing. The U.S. military's commitment to the Constitution, its tradition of staying out of politics, those are what keep things stable. But if you replace those leaders with people who are just yes men, like Pete Hegseth maybe getting a top spot in the Pentagon, who knows what could happen, you can see unlawful orders. Like, imagine troops being deployed against American citizens under the Insurrection Act, that federal law that lets the president use military force within the country under certain circumstances. And there's even been talk that this kind of thing could split the military itself. Some soldiers might refuse to follow illegal orders while others obey. A divided military, or one that's focused on internal politics, could then embolden all those armed civilian groups out there. They might see it as a sign that the federal government is weak, or even as a green light to start something themselves.
That's a pretty scary picture you're painting there. So how did Grok adjust its assessment after learning about all of this, the potential court defiance and the military situation?
Well, after taking those potential actions into account, Grok upped its prediction for a second civil war before November 2026, from 15%, 20% to 25%, 30%. That's a pretty big jump, and it reflects the increased risk of things escalating very quickly. You have a potentially compromised military and a weakening of those legal checks on executive power. While Grok still recognizes that the time frame is short and most people want peace, the scenario of a unified armed resistance from states or citizens against the federal government, it's become a lot more plausible.
Right. But Abramson didn't stop there. He also brought up Trump's past actions and his recent aggressive language.
Exactly. Abramson pointed to Trump's track record. He talked about reports that during his first term, Trump had allegedly pushed for using force against peaceful protesters, actions that were apparently blocked by advisors who were more, let's say, traditional in their approach. He also highlighted Trump's more recent aggressive talk, like remember when he talked about invading Greenland and Panama? And then there's the potential for huge public unrest if there are major cuts to Social Security. Millions of Americans depend on that.
A president even thinking about using force against peaceful protesters is chilling. And people like Mark Esper and John Bolton have spoken publicly about moments like that. It's really disturbing. And Abramson's point about those advisors is key. The people who might have stopped those impulses before, they're not around anymore.
Exactly. People like Stephen Miller, Chad Wolf, and maybe even Pete Hegseth if he gets a top job. They seem to be more ideologically aligned with Trump and probably less likely to tell him no. This lack of internal checks, compared to folks like Esper and Barr, could lead to a much more aggressive and escalatory response if we see widespread protests again.
And those past comments about military action in other countries? Sure, they might have seemed far-fetched at the time, but as Abramson pointed out, they show a certain comfort level with using force on a large scale.
Yeah, they do. Some might dismiss them as just talk, but Trump's refusal to rule out using military force suggests a willingness to push boundaries and potentially escalate things, both at home and abroad. This kind of mindset could definitely lead to a more aggressive approach to handling dissent within the country.
And the possibility of cuts to Social Security. With so many Americans relying on those benefits, that seems like it could be a powder keg. It could spark massive protests.
No doubt. You've got around 67 million Americans who depend on Social Security. Any significant reduction in benefits could be a huge trigger. Jerry Jacobus, the commentator, she said on social media that it could be the tipping point that leads to mass public action. And we have historical examples of this kind of thing. The Bonus Army protests in 1932, for example, where World War I veterans were demanding early payment of their bonuses. They were met with military force. Things turned violent. And in today's polarized climate, the reaction to big Social Security cuts could be way more volatile.
And we've seen how Trump reacts to protests he doesn't like. His comments about the January 6 rioters, his criticism of the Black Lives Matter protests, and even that tweet, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." It seems very likely that he would use the Insurrection Act if there were large-scale protests, especially if the military is more aligned with his administration.
Yeah, the Brennan Center for Justice and others have pointed out how urban protests can turn deadly when the government uses excessive force. They draw parallels to things like the Kent State shootings back in 1970. And when you factor in all the heavily armed civilian groups on both sides of the political spectrum, along with a potentially politicized military, well, the risk of isolated clashes turning into a much wider conflict goes up significantly.
So after considering Trump's past behavior, his aggressive language, and the potential for protests, what did Grok do with his probability assessment?
Taking all of that into account, especially the possibility of huge protests if there are Social Security cuts and the likelihood that the Trump administration would respond aggressively, Grok raised its estimated probability of a second civil war before November 2026 to 35% to 40%. That increase is mainly driven by the short time frame and the potential for things to escalate quickly and violently.
But Abramson didn't just stop at those immediate triggers. He also went deeper, talking about broader economic and cultural instability.
Right, he broadened the scope. He brought up the possibility of a recession or even a full-blown depression caused by Trump's policies. Things that might help the wealthy elite but hurt everyone else. He also talked about the potential for unrest due to mass deportations, including some that might be illegal. And then there's the impact of mass layoffs of federal workers, inflation caused by tariffs, and public anger over the administration's stance on the situation in Gaza.
The economic arguments are pretty stark. We've seen economists warning about the potential negative impacts of large-scale tariffs. They say it could hurt GDP and cause inflation. And then you have the potential disruption from mass deportations, labor shortages, less consumer spending. And the Atlanta Fed's recent GDP now forecast isn't exactly encouraging.
No, it's not. Organizations like the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the International Monetary Fund have warned about the serious economic fallout from Trump's proposed tariffs, especially the idea of a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico, and maybe even a 60% tariff on stuff from China. And analyses from Northeastern University show that mass deportations, which could involve as many as 11 million people, according to DHS, could lead to severe labor shortages. If those deportations happen alongside Social Security cuts, you're looking at a double whammy on consumer spending. That could easily trigger a major economic downturn. And public opinion polls, like the ones from Reuters Ipsos, suggest a lot of people already believe that Trump's policies favor billionaires. That perception could make things even worse in a shaky economic climate.
And mass deportations, especially if they ignore court orders, seem like they could create so much tension. You could see violence between federal agents and local communities.
Absolutely. The Trump administration has made it clear that mass deportations are a top priority from day one. Advisors like Stephen Miller have been outlining these big, ambitious plans. There are already reports of ICE carrying out a high number of deportations every day since January 2025. And then you have those worrying reports of deportations happening outside of legal channels. This kind of thing could easily lead to clashes between federal agents and protesters, maybe even with the National Guard if states decide to resist. It's a situation that could escalate really quickly.
And then there are the potential mass layoffs of federal workers.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from the economic impact on those individuals, it could also cripple the government and further erode public trust.
You're right. Dismantling big chunks of the federal workforce, like what's being proposed with this Department of Government Efficiency, reportedly led by Elon Musk, could have huge consequences.
Yeah.
It's not just about job losses. It's about losing all that expertise and seeing a further decline in public faith in the government. And if these layoffs hit a broad range of communities, including people who might normally support the administration, it could shift public opinion in unexpected ways. It could even fuel unrest.
And we can't forget about the impact of tariffs and inflation on ordinary Americans. It makes the things they need more expensive.
The tariffs that are already in place, plus the threat of even higher tariffs, have definitely pushed up prices on everyday items. Consumer confidence is dropping, and organizations like the Conference Board are tracking this. It's a sign that people are anxious about the economy. If inflation keeps going up, it could trigger widespread discontent, leading to protest and unrest. We've seen it happen before during tough economic times.
And the situation in Gaza adds another layer of potential tension here at home. Trump's strong support for Israel has drawn a lot of criticism, and we're seeing protests all over the country.
You're right. Trump's unwavering support for Israel, despite the conflict and accusations of human rights abuses, has sparked major protests here in the U.S. If people see U.S. policy as enabling suffering, it could unite a diverse range of groups in opposition. This would add another layer to the already high tensions and could lead to bigger, more intense protests.
So taking all of that into account, the potential for economic turmoil, the social unrest from mass deportations and layoffs, the rising inflation, and the international situation, how did Grok adjust its assessment of the probability of a civil war?
Given the much higher risk of a major economic downturn happening at the same time as all this potential social unrest, Grok raised its probability of a second civil war before November 2026 to 45% to 50%. This reflects a scenario where a huge economic crisis sparks widespread social unrest, potentially leading to regional conflicts and a breakdown of federal authority.
Okay, but Abramson wasn't done yet. He then shifted his focus to the people around Trump and the overall political and social climate.
Exactly. He raised a bunch of interconnected concerns. He talked about the increasingly radical views of Trump's advisors, Trump's own rhetoric that breaks norms and inflames tensions, and even accusations that Elon Musk's actions on social media have fueled violence in other countries. He also highlighted the influence of figures like Curtis Yarvin, who has these anti-democratic ideas, on Vice President Vance. And then there's the talk of a potential third term for Trump, even though it's against the Constitution. Add to that Elon Musk's apparent fear of facing legal trouble if Trump isn't in power, Trump's history of inciting violence and pardoning allies, his constant use of social media to spread divisive messages, and the potential consequences of the Supreme Court's ruling in Trump v. United States, which deals with presidential immunity.
It's a lot to process, and it's pretty disturbing. The idea that key advisors are pushing extreme ideologies is definitely a red flag. And the fact that someone like Curtis Yarvin, who openly wants to dismantle democracy, could be influencing the vice president? It's very worrying.
It shows a serious shift away from democratic norms and principles. You have advisors pushing hardline, even radical policies. And then you have Trump's increasingly inflammatory language phrases like Liberation Day and vermin purges, which are really unsettling. It suggests a disregard for democratic processes and a willingness to demonize opponents.
And Elon Musk's role in all this is complicated and potentially very influential. He's given a lot of money to Trump, and he's involved in things like the proposed Department of Government Efficiency. That gives him a lot of power. And the allegations that he's used social media to incite violence and spread conspiracy theories are serious and should be investigated.
Musk's close relationship with Trump, combined with his huge platform on social media, creates a potentially destabilizing force, especially when you consider how volatile things already are. The accusations that he's spread misinformation or amplified divisive content could definitely make things worse. And the fact that he's reportedly worried about facing legal consequences if Trump leaves office raises questions about his motives and what he might do in the future.
And Trump talking openly about a third term, even though the Constitution says he can't, along with his past actions inciting violence, that stand back and stand by comment, the pardons. It paints a picture of someone who doesn't respect the rules of democracy.
You're right. Trump hinting at a third term, despite the 22nd Amendment and his history of inciting violence and rewarding those who help him, it shows a willingness to ignore the rules and potentially disregard the Constitution. And his continued use of social media to spread divisive messages just reinforces this pattern.
And that Supreme Court ruling that gives presidents near total immunity for things they do while in office, that could have huge implications, right? It could shield them from legal accountability for actions that might even contribute to civil unrest.
Absolutely. The Supreme Court's decision in Trump v. United States, which basically gives presidents a free pass for a lot of what they do while in office, is a big deal. The dissenting opinions, like the one from Justice Sonia Sotomayor, warns that this could create a situation where presidents are above the law. It could delay or prevent them from being held accountable for actions they took while in office, even if those actions lead to major conflict within the country.
So considering all of these interconnected factors, the radical advisors, the disregard for norms, Musk's influence, Trump's past behavior, and that Supreme Court ruling, how did Grok change his assessment of the likelihood of civil war?
All of these things together, the growing radicalization within the government, the disregard for democratic rules and the law, the potential for social division being amplified from outside, and the perception that Trump's actions are shielded from consequences led Grok to significantly increase its probability of a second civil war before November 2026 to 55% to 60%. That big jump shows that the risk is much higher now based on the perceived intent, capacity, and opportunity for actions that could lead to widespread conflict.
And to wrap things up, Abramson brought up some very specific and potentially decisive concerns about the elections themselves.
Yes, his final key concerns focused on the possibility of Trump taking control of the U.S. Postal Service, and then maybe using that control to limit or even completely ban mail-in voting in the 2026 midterms. Remember the bomb threats against those Democratic voting places back in 2024, and Trump's repeated false claims about widespread voter fraud during that same election? Abramson is worried that Trump could use federal forces or even encourage paramilitary groups to disrupt voting in 2026.
Trying to control the USPS to restrict mail-in voting. With so many people voting by mail and certain demographics relying on it more than others, it would be seen as a blatant attempt to manipulate the election. It would undermine the entire process.
Exactly. There are reports of a possible executive order to put the U.S. Postal Service under the direct control of the White House. That's really worrying for our elections. If mail-in voting is restricted or banned, remember millions of Americans used it in 2020, and it tends to be favored by Democratic voters, a lot of people could be prevented from voting, and it would almost certainly be seen as election rigging, which would erode public trust in democracy even further and could lead to widespread anger and protests.
And those bomb threats against Democratic voting places in 2024, that kind of intimidation could easily escalate and discourage people from voting in future elections.
Right. Those threats, which the FBI said were linked to both domestic and foreign actors, were a direct attack on our elections. If we see more of this in 2026, maybe even with actual violence or intimidation at polling places, it could really lower voter turnout. And it could fuel those false claims of a stolen election, especially if the federal response under a Trump administration is weak or even seems to be helping those carrying out the attacks.
And then there's Trump himself, falsely claiming widespread fraud on Election Day in 2024. And the possibility that he could use federal forces or encourage paramilitary groups in 2026. That sounds like a recipe for complete disaster. It could easily lead to violence at polling places.
As the sitting president in 2026, Trump would have a lot more power to act on those unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud. He could send in the National Guard or the FBI to polling places, claiming it's to prevent fraud, or he could even encourage those paramilitary groups to act as unofficial poll watchers. This could create a climate of fear and lead to direct confrontations, maybe even violence, with voters, election officials, or local police. And remember the broad immunity he got from the Trump v. United States ruling, along with the possibility of invoking the Insurrection Act. Those things could give him legal cover for these actions, at least in the short term.
So with all these threats to our elections, what was Grok's final assessment? What's the probability of a second U.S. Civil War?
Taking all of that into account, the potential for election tampering, the likelihood of a strong public backlash, Grok raised its probability of a second civil war before November 2026 to its highest level yet, 65% to 70%. This scenario is one where deliberate attempts to subvert the democratic process spark widespread public anger and unrest, leading to a sustained and widespread conflict.
And then Abramson asked Grok to speculate on the potential human cost. You know, how many people would be hurt or killed in the 5-year Civil War from mid-2026 to mid-2031? And the numbers Grok gave were just devastating.
They were. Grok outlined three scenarios: a low end, a medium end, and a high end scenario. They acknowledged that it's hard to be precise, but they used historical data from other conflicts and considered the specific conditions in the U.S. Grok thinks it would be more of a fragmented, asymmetric insurgency, not a traditional war. You have to factor in the high rate of gun ownership in the U.S. and its advanced infrastructure.
Even the low-end scenario, where the violence is sporadic, was terrifying. Grok predicted thousands of people killed and tens of thousands wounded over those 5 years.
Yeah, even in that best-case scenario, the projected casualties were huge. It's comparable to the high levels of gun violence we already have, but this would be specifically driven by political clashes.
The medium-end scenario, which Grok said was the most likely given its probability assessment, painted an even grimmer picture. Tens of thousands killed and hundreds of thousands wounded. That's on par with the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia.
The medium scenario involves sustained regional conflict with more frequent and intense fighting. The casualty numbers are similar to the wars in Yugoslavia, adjusted for the U.S.'s larger population and its better health care. The widespread availability of guns and the likely involvement of militia groups, those are big factors.
And the high-end scenario, which is basically a complete breakdown of order, was the most terrifying. Grok predicted hundreds of thousands killed and potentially over 1 million wounded. That's getting close to the casualty figures from the original Civil War.
The high-end scenario is a complete collapse, widespread and intense violence across the whole country. Modern medicine might mean a lower death rate than in the 1860s, but the sheer scale of the conflict could overwhelm the healthcare system, still leading to a huge number of casualties.
And at the end of their conversation, Abramson asked Grok a very direct question. He wanted to know if the United States would still be a democracy in the midst of that most likely Civil War scenario. Grok's answer was just one word, and it was chilling.
Grok simply said, no.
So to sum it all up, Grok's final assessment is very alarming. A 65% to 70% probability of a second U.S. Civil War before November 2026. In the most likely scenario, tens of thousands of Americans would be killed, hundreds of thousands wounded, and our democracy would cease to exist.
The key takeaway here is that the factors driving this assessment are really concerning. Our democratic institutions seem fragile, there's a growing chance of our elections being sabotaged, political radicalization is getting worse, and there's a very real risk of all of this leading to widespread violence.
It's a really unsettling thought, isn't it? And AI, after analyzing tons of data, concludes that the risk of the United States falling apart is this high. It makes you think about what's causing this instability and what role we all play as individuals and as part of institutions in making things better or worse.
This deep dive is really just the start of trying to understand this complex and crucial issue. We encourage you to dig into the source material we've talked about, to do your own research on the historical parallels, the first U.S. Civil War, the conflicts in Yugoslavia and Syria, the different protest movements and election disputes throughout U.S. history. It's important to think critically about all of this and to seriously consider what the future holds for our country.